All right, everybody, welcome to Coffee with the Founder, and I'm back with another episode. Got my coffee cup, got my coffee drink, and of course, we have another phenomenal guest here joining us today, Cindu Thomas-George. Cindu, we are doing these coffee talks as a way to introduce people to the WPC family, the great work they're doing, because sometimes people see you at conferences, they get to interact with you briefly, but they don't know about the work you do once you leave there. And so that's what we decided to do, is try to introduce the world to the good folks out there doing everyday work with everyday people. So let's start by asking you, who are you? What do you do?
So I am, sorry, I'm just texting my husband to make sure my kids don't come in. My name is Cindu, like you said, and I'm a tenured professor of communication studies at the College of Lake County. I've been teaching in higher education since 2004, and I've been in my tenured roles for 12 years, and I'm also a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. So it's a little bit about me professionally. I sit on the board of YWCA Lake County, which is an organization that's committed to eliminating racism and empowering women. So I have a lot of passions around diversity, inclusion, equity, and anti-racism. One of my specialties at the college is intercultural communication. So I'm an intercultural specialist, and I kind of combine my intercultural specialty with the DEI work in the work that I do as a practitioner.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about intercultural specialists, IDI, and that whole community as it relates to particularly issues of white supremacy, white privilege, because I used to often say they don't push enough, so I want to ask you about that. But before I do, I want to ask you to talk to us. How did you get to this position? Did you grow up saying, hey, I'm going to be a college professor, a diversity consultant? I mean, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, I learned that I wanted to be a college professor when I was a junior in high school, and I actually have an undergrad in social work. I went through some stuff when I was younger, and that really helped me, but I took some communication classes and I said, wow, like this is exactly what I want to do. And it was the first time that helped me understand, my experience as an immigrant, a child of an immigrant, and just some of the communication barriers and challenges that I had and that my family had. So I thought that specifically the information around intercultural communication was so beneficial and almost life-changing. So that's kind of how I knew I wanted to be a professor. And so when I studied in graduate school intercultural communication, I saw the whole kind of connection with helping people in organizations, with and increasing their intercultural competency. And so that's kind of when I realized I can make a career out of this. But I think my impetus was just my own experiences of racism and xenophobia and sexism throughout my whole childhood, and even again when I started at teaching college as a young woman of color. So I grew up in a predominantly white suburb outside of Chicago, and we were the only family of color for years. And so I experienced a lot of racism. My name is Cindu, it rhymes with Hindu, so Cindu the Hindu was, my nickname. And just I would say it was a painful, childhood in some regards. It was a happy childhood in others. Also just being raised by immigrant parents who come from a very sexist culture. I'm Indian, so patriarchy and sexism is part of our DNA. It's almost like racism in America. We don't even realize it happens when it happens. So that, and then when I started teaching as a young woman in higher education, I experienced a lot of extreme ageism, racism, sexism. And so I know what it feels like to be othered in the workplace. And that's really the passion that I bring to my work as a consultant in organizations, is that I don't want anyone to experience what I did, right? And when I work with educators, I want to empower teachers, because I experienced a lot of racism in front of my teachers, sometimes from my teachers, and no one really said anything. But again, it was back in the 80s. Did they know what to say? I want to believe that they weren't inherently racist or xenophobic or prejudiced. They just didn't know how to deal with it, or maybe they weren't aware of their own racism. And so that's kind of why I do some of the work that I do.
Yeah, that's, I mean, nothing like life experience to help you in your life's work.
Yeah.
I want to come back. I'm going to come back to asking you a little bit about really talking with and working with young people, maybe dealing with some of it, what you dealt with even today.
Hmm.
But before that, let's go to intercultural competencies.
Sure.
Now, what I want to know is intercultural competency the same as diversity competency? I mean, how do you distinguish or define interculturalist or intercultural competency versus cultural competence, diversity, inclusion?
Yeah.
Are those things all synonymous? I mean, how do you explain that or kind of define that for different groups of people?
Yeah. So I think that, diversity is this umbrella, right? There's so many different facets and areas of interest, and intercultural work is one part of it. Typically, it is siloed from the DEI world. And I think that, in my opinion, because I'm biased and I'm an interculturalist, that intercultural competency is a missing link to DEI. So there's a lot of separate components that need to be married. So DEI look more as equity and inclusion and belonging, and how do we cultivate a culture of inclusion and belonging? How do we understand that we need equity before we can get to equality? Talking about things like race privilege and power and a lot of identity work, and and other things that I'm not going to. There's so many areas that you can go into. Implicit bias, and then intercultural work is how do we communicate effectively across cultures, right? So one of the areas is looking at how are we different, privilege and power and racism and equity. And then the other interculturalists look at, well, how can we be on the same page? How can we instill skills so that we can communicate effectively? So I think there's awareness building and skill building with intercultural work. And in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, most of the time, it's a lot of awareness building, which is really important. So they both are important on their own. But I think that you need both of them to be really effective in terms of training and empowering people to see how they can build bridges, with people of difference.
Yeah. So how do you respond if someone says interculturalist, don't push hard enough? They don't really look at white supremacy, white privilege. They're not
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
challenging people. What's your
Mhm.
response to folks who?
I agree. I think that traditionally, and there are definitely some of us that are looking at privilege and supremacy and disrupting supremacy, but there's not a lot. I think that definitely the traditional interculturalist is going to look at, like, the whole, like, kumbaya, let's sing a song and let's celebrate. That's, I think, traditionally the approach, and I do have that critique as well. But I think that more and more, because the concept, as you know, of race privilege is becoming part of the mainstream, conversation. Anyone doing work across cultures is going to be more exposed to that today than they were 15 years ago, right? And so there is a lot of some interculturalists just look at expats and training people to go abroad, and some look at just students and study abroad, and some people are looking in global organizations and they're helping people to communicate effectively and doing, how do you non-verbally and verbally communicate differently based off your culture. And they're all really good, important skills, but I think that you have to also think about privilege, identity. Those are all really important if you're going to move the needle towards inclusion.
Yeah, yeah. That's helpful. That's helpful. You had mentioned, some of the challenges you face uh, coming up, growing up there in the community where you were raised. And I wanted to know if you're, or as you encounter young people or families who may have kids or daughters specifically, facing some of the challenges that, you remember, what is your advice to young women of color, young, uh, um, uh, specifically, possibly East Indian young
Yeah.
women and some of their challenges? Are those things different? So just wondering how you talk to young people today when you find they may be facing some of the stuff you faced back in the 80s.
Yeah. Um, one of my mottos is different isn't deficient, right? Different is just different. And that's what makes America beautiful, right? Is that we are different, and we would be so boring if we were all the same. And I think that it's really important to embrace your differences and to not be ashamed of them and to be proud of them. And I think the difference between someone like me who grew up in the 80s and somebody who's growing up today or who's just still in their early 20s is there's a lot more diversity. There are a lot, and specifically, you know, I'm South Asian. There's a lot more South Asian people being raised in this country today. There's representation on television, in media, in mediated text, you know, and so there is a lot more pride. And I'm so glad that, you know, people in this generation that are growing up have that representation so that they have less of a chance to grow up being ashamed of being Indian, which is what I did. You know, I was really ashamed. I lived in a world of whiteness, you know, that was very much invisible to me as a person of color. And I did things like change my name to Cindy and wear green colored contacts and, you know, even deny that I was Indian. And I'm Christian. So, you know, I'm the minority. 80% of Indians are Hindu. And so in my mind, because I was called Hindu in such a derogatory term, I always try to distance myself from Hinduism, which, you know, I don't belong to that religion, but it was almost like aligning myself more with whiteness. And so I'm Catholic. So I would, you know, recite Hail Mary and Our Father so that I found more common ground with my white friends. And so I think that growing up, you know, clearly I had a lot of identity issues. And it wasn't until I was in grad school studying whiteness theory, reading Franz Fanon and, you know, some of the theorists that shaped my perspectives that I said, wow, what the hell am I doing? And it was painful. You know, I had to then acknowledge that I've been living this alternate identity that I hadn't even been aware of. And it was like I had that realization when I was like 23 or 24, you know. And so it was really, it shows you that academia and education can really be transformative to somebody. So yeah, I think I answered your question.
Oh, that's really helpful. That's
study,
really helpful.
study and read and talk to people and don't be ashamed of your difference. Specifically South Asian girls that are growing up, I think that it doesn't matter if you're first or second generation, you know, South Asian, you are probably being raised in a sexist household in some regard. And, you know, patriarchy is very much part of South Asian culture. And I think it's really important to disrupt that patriarchy. I say smash the patriarchy. I actually made a shirt that said that. Because you don't want to just accept that, you know, you're a girl, so stay home, or you're a girl, so you can't do this. You know, there's a lot of rules that are really aligned with our culture. So we can't blame our families, you know, for thinking that way. But now, because we are in the United States or Canada or wherever you're living, you know, you don't have to accept that as your reality if you don't feel aligned with, you know, patriarchy. So I think it's empowering to know that you can be who you want to be and just push against the sexism all the time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was going to ask you about definitions and terminology because I
Oh,
know you've written a little bit and talked a little bit about just the evolving language. In particular, you talk about this BIPOC. POC.
yeah, BIPOC.
Yeah, so BIPOC, I want to ask you to talk about that. But I also said, as I was asking my last question, East Indian as opposed to East Asian as opposed to South Asian.
Yeah,
And first, it made me think about how much learning I'm still doing in reference to
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But
There's
also,
always learning. You're always learning. We're always
yeah,
learning.
yeah, but also thinking about this Chinese virus and
Yep.
the pandemic and just what you're seeing in reference to the Asia Pacific Islander community as a whole.
Yeah.
And if there are some signs of some more collaboration, some unity in reference to dealing with some of what I think after this going to see possibly some rise in
Oh, yeah.
anti-Asian sentiment. So
Yeah.
all of that, what's your thought around
Well,
first?
I'll start with the what you just talked about, and actually even acknowledge, you know, first of all, Asia is a huge, 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 huge place, right? And in America, because race is socially constructed, so many different identity groups are put into this one little category. So I am technically Asian, and so are my Chinese friends, but we have very little in common in terms of traditions and language. And maybe we're both collectivist in nature, but that's probably about it, you know? And so that's one thing. So don't feel bad that you said East Asian, because that's a common thing. But I think that the anti-Asian sentiment, specifically the anti-Chinese sentiment, is something that is definitely worrisome. I think there's a lot, I think in my eyes, there's solidarity building, maybe because I'm doing some of that work. I just did a webinar with a psychologist and a DEI practitioner about disrupting anti-Asian bias in, the COVID-19 crisis, because AAPI Stop Hate is an organization, and they report 100 hate crimes, anti-Asian hate a day, not hate crimes, but incidents of hate a day. And we're on lockdown. Most of the country is not leaving their house, and we're seeing 100 incidents of anti-Asian hate. So imagine when our country reopens up again. And so I think that that's certainly an issue. And I think that it's so important for people who care about solidarity and racial equity and equality to stand up and stand for East Asians, because people are going to be targeted, and it's kind of like after 9/11 happened, I had to worry about, my safety and my parents and so many people who look like me, even though we have nothing to do with, extremists, and jihadists. And so I think that now we're going to see the same thing. I hope not, but I'm assuming that we're going to see an increase in hate against Asian people in this country and across the world.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's really important, because I think about, just being the father of Black kids, multiracial kids, and not that they'll receive that, but they'll see that. So it's not only really helping kids to handle what they may be receiving, but also how to get my kids prepared to be allies,
Yeah.
and really stand up and stand with some kids that we know, this is, like you said, there are just certain things that happen in our society, and we know people are going to pay the price
Yeah.
once things start back to whatever the new normal is. So
Yeah.
what
And
are you saying to your kids to get them ready to stand as allies?
I have a 5 and a 9-year-old, and they know about racism, and they're very race conscious people. And we talk a lot about, inequalities and the importance to stand up against, racism. And we talk about skin color. I have my 5-year-old son, I think it was when he was 4. He's the only white kid, he's the only non-white presenting kid in his kindergarten. It was just when he was 5, like 6 months ago. And I was getting him ready for school, and he was saying, Mama, Mama, I want to be right. I'm like, what do you mean, right? And he was saying, Mama, Mama, I want to be white. Everybody is white. And it just broke my heart, that at 5 years old, my kid was feeling that. And then the next day he said, Mama, Jesus is right. And I'm like, what? Yeah, Jesus is right. And he's like, I want to be right. But he was really saying, Jesus is white. I want to be white. So then I teach white privilege in my classes. So I took a picture of what Jesus really looked like. I said, this is where he's from. He was not white. This is something that was, done to increase the popularity of Christianity. So I might not, be appropriate in telling my kids as much as I do, but they are very race conscious. But I think you just have to teach them to stand in solidarity against, hate, and I think we live in a pretty white community in Chicago, but they're very open-minded, and I would say even anti-racist in some ways. And so we're lucky, that I don't have to worry about, and I live in a city. I purposely live in a city because I don't want my kids to experience what I did. And so I'm thinking that they're going to grow up around diversity without even thinking about it, and be in the right mind frame to be an ally to others.
So talk a little bit about BIPOC.
Oh,
I
yeah.
saw that the article was really related to like African American Heritage Month or Black History Month, and really you talking about the expanding of that and not limiting that to just that 1 month, which you sometimes hear, but not really talking about it with an expansion of identity. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so BIPOC is a term that I think came up like 2 years ago, and it's becoming increasingly popular with activists and educators and authors, in the racial justice and diversity spaces. And it's an alternative to saying people of color. And I think that it's something that's going to catch on. And the reason why it's important to consider adopting BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, is because you don't want to clump, all these different identity groups into one term, which is people of color. So that's one, because we have one term to, identify white people for one race, But then for people of color, we're taking like, you know, several groups and we're saying, okay, you're all that. And that in itself strengthens whiteness, right? And so one reason is to kind of decenter whiteness. Another reason is because Black people and Indigenous people, at least African American people and Indigenous people in this country, have a unique history that is not shared by someone like myself, right? And so you're looking at the history of oppression, the history of systemic racism, that is not acknowledged in the term people of color. And as you know, there's a lot of internalized, you know, conflict and racism within communities of color. And so it's a good reminder for a privileged person of color like myself coming from South Asia. My parents immigrated here in the early 70s after the civil rights movement. And the path for them was literally paved for Black Americans fighting for, you know, their rights and their basic equality. And so we as a community have really benefited from African Americans. And I think it's important for communities of color, people of color, to acknowledge that. And one of the ways that they could is through, you know, distinguishing Black, Indigenous people of color. And then there's, of course, the whole history of Indigenous Americans. And so it's just a way to acknowledge that not every person of color has the same history and same background. And it's to honor, you know, the experiences of Black Americans and Indigenous Americans.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now, you mentioned teaching white privilege at the college.
Yep.
Can you
I just did it today
yeah,
on
can you
Zoom.
talk about what you try to accomplish over a semester when you're working with students around this topic?
Yeah.
What are some of your goals, and what's been some of the challenge that you face, some pushback in reference to bringing this topic to the college campus?
Yeah, so I've been teaching white privilege in my intercultural communication classes. So kind of going back to interculturals don't talk about privilege, you know, there are people who do. And so I have a lot of experience doing it. In my intercultural class, my goal is to not just equip people with skills, but for them to be change agents, right? For them to have at least an opening and awareness of the importance of working towards social justice and working across, you know, identity groups, and not just looking to amplify your own voice and your own identity group, but working to amplify the voices of people who don't have the microphone, right? So at the end of the semester, the goal is how can you be a change agent, right? What are you going to do to be a transformative agent of change that can help, you know, move our country towards a more inclusive one? In terms of white privilege, I always teach it at the end of the semester, which is why our semester is over next week. So it's one of the last lessons, because I think you need to have a level of cultural competency to talk about it from an informed perspective without just getting so emotional, and understanding this is a concept, this is a theory, this is not something that some, you know, journalist on the news created or a social media person. This has been, you know, studied for years and years and years. And I think I do get some pushback, but not a lot, actually. And I think it's harder to talk about white privilege now after Trayvon Martin was murdered, because that phrase has just become part of our popular culture conversation, right? And so people come into my classroom, or if I'm talking about it in a consulting, you know, aspect, they come into that room already having all these ideas and preconceived notions of white privilege. And sometimes people talk about white privilege from a blame, a shame, and a guilt perspective. And I think that that is, it's not effective at reaching white people, right? And so I think that makes my job a little harder, but I do get some pushback. Oftentimes it's from white males. So once in a while I get it from a female, but I think that the pushback is a lot less now because it is talked about so largely as well. And I use lots of different media. You know, I use Robin DiAngelo, a video of her. Who is the woman that you work with a lot?
Debbie Irving.
Yes, Debbie Irving. I show them her video. You know, I have Paul Gorski's article. You know, I use a lot of great resources, and I think I really tried to emphasize that it is not any white person's fault today that white privilege exists. It's not their parents, it's not their grandparents, it's not their great grandparents. This is a society that was created to privilege white people, right? And so they might benefit from it, but they didn't create it. And so I think that also helps people of color who are kind of like, I wish I had this privilege, to not be so angry. And also white people to feel, okay, well, I didn't do anything from it. Let me at least acknowledge that I'm a benefactor of this. And so that's a little bit about my approach. I mean, I could go on, but we don't have too
Oh,
much.
that's helpful. That's helpful. Um, yeah, because I would assume you get people coming up, students possibly, but in the consulting world, folks saying, I mean, how do I do what you do? How do I teach about this or consult about this? So what's your advice for any young professionals thinking about coming into the business of consulting or even teaching at the college level, particularly, you know, teaching issues around diversity,
Yeah.
intercultural inclusion, so on and so forth?
Yeah. Well, from a teaching perspective, you have to get the right degree, right? Because every department, they're very specific on they will not hire you unless you have this degree, right? So I came into it through intercultural communication. I only have a master's degree. And so I have like my dream job. You know, I'm a tenured professor. I love my job. I love teaching and working with students. I'm not focused on writing and research as much. My passion lies within educating and doing training and development. And so get the right degree. And there's so many different ways to talk about diversity. You don't have to only do intercultural communication. You can have a degree in psychology. You can have a degree in critical race studies. You can, you know, there's so many different avenues, but you should, when you're studying, you know, in graduate school, you should have some focus and do some work around, you know, if you want to talk about white privilege, race privilege, or issues of inclusion. So I think it's, if you want to be a college professor, you got to have the right degree. You don't have to have a doctorate. You can teach at private colleges, you can teach at community colleges and have a really fulfilling teaching career. And then in terms of breaking into the DEI world, I think it's really easy, or it seems like there's diversity consultants coming out of the woodworks, you know, as you probably know, because you've been doing this way longer than I have, in the last 5 years. And so I think, if anything, it's probably easier now than it was when I started to become a diversity consultant. There are certificate programs. There are, you were doing something with the Matrix a while ago, right? There are like degree programs. I know the USC Race and Equity program that Sean Harper is kind of in charge of. They have like programs. And so you can actually get some solid education without having to go to like grad school. But I think it's really important to read, to be prepared. Um, and you should be doing it not because you want to make money, right? If your impetus is the business case and there's so much money to be made, I don't think that no matter what you do, you're going to be successful, because it should be coming from an authentic place. Because diversity and inclusion, yes, you can make, you know, organizations will be successful if they adopt this, because they'll be more innovative and they'll be, you know, more profitable. But if you're not doing this to really help the experience of the employees and, you know, for social responsibility and to make people feel a sense of belonging, then I think that will be apparent, right? And so I think, why are you doing it, and just be dedicated to it. I started when I was real young. You know, it wasn't always a success. And, you know, with the COVID thing, I'm lucky I have virtual trainings and stuff like that. But I went years with trying and hustling, and, you know, something would happen and then nothing would happen for a while. I also am a full-time professor, so I don't have time to do marketing, and I never have done anything like that. But I've struggled, you know, and so if you're really passionate about it, then don't give up and keep at it, because if you care about it and you love it, it'll happen.
Thank you for that. Now, you mentioned COVID-19. How are you and the family doing? Shelter in place. I think we're on 40, day 40 something. I've lost count of
Uh,
the days.
yeah,
But wondering how y'all are doing, how you're doing. But also, I mean, knowing that Chicago has faced some real challenges around COVID-19, what's your sense of how the larger Chicagoland area is doing around the pandemic as well?
yeah. Well, I think the pandemic shines a light on just how much inequality we have, right? 70% of deaths in Chicago are from the African American community. So that's something that even makes the DEI conversation even more important now than ever. I think our we have a lesbian Black mayor, which I'm so proud of, to be, you know, part of the city and have a woman that has different minoritized identities lead us. She's done a great job. So unfortunately, we can't leave our homes really, you know, like take a 20-minute run and that's about it. There's no parks, there's no beachfront, there's no nothing. So apparently we are doing a decent job of flattening the curve. So I think that's good. Um, I'm a, you know, full-time professor. I have a consulting business and I homeschool, so I'm going crazy, or I'm just having a hard time with my own mental health, to be honest with you. And I started seeing a therapist a couple weeks ago through Zoom, which is amazing. It's been helping, but I think it's a struggle for a lot of people. In terms of my consulting business, I was shocked when it first started. I had a lot of things lined up, speaking at Encore, lots of consulting gigs. I got accepted into Inbound to speak about intercultural communication and all these big, gigs. And I was like, oh, nothing's gonna happen. And I was really grateful for my full-time job, because there was times where I thought maybe I should go into consulting because it's more lucrative. But somehow I've been just as busy as I normally am. I think virtual training is something that a lot of people are looking for. A lot of organizations want to keep business as is. And so they're trying to also provide talent development for their employees. And so, I have a couple gigs next week and the following week. And so I'll see how it goes. But right now I feel really fortunate. And I think of course, training, and I know I talked to you on email, you said you'd rather do face-to-face and this is all new. I also think that if you have the option, always do a face-to-face training. But in this time, when you don't have the option, get to know platforms like Zoom and functions like the breakout rooms and sharing screens and research how you can do an effective and engaging workshop that can really be meaningful. So, yeah.
Well, keep me posted on how your virtual training is going.
Yeah.
I'm starting to venture out and let go of this old school mentality. I also appreciate you mentioning mental health because I don't think we're having enough conversations about that. And I know for myself, I mean, like you said, I mean, I literally went from traveling, thousands of miles a year to zero.
Yeah.
And I think I'm doing okay, but there's no real measurement. And so
Yeah.
this helps remind, hopefully, all of us that not only that we take care of our physical and some of whatever we need to do spiritually, but also we got to take care of the mental health. That's really important. What are you going to be when you grow up? What's ahead of you? What's the next 10 years hold?
Oh,
Anything
I'm
you're
a
excited
40-year-old. I just turned 40 on Monday. I am grown.
So what's on the horizon? What are you thinking about over the next 10 years as you look at,
Yeah. So I have a dual career. So for my consulting, I'm looking at growing more. So I was primarily doing higher ed and K through 12, nonprofit, government, mental health. And in the last 6 months, because I live in Chicago and the tech scene is blowing up and every industry needs, diversity and inclusion work. So one of my goals, and it's happening, is to go more into the business world and grow my business more and create more awareness about these important topics outside of higher ed and mental health and government. So that's one. And then in the academic world, I've been doing a lot of professional development with faculty and administrators. And I just finished creating a 15-week course for faculty on creating inclusion for African American students. And I'm really passionate about disrupting anti-Blackness in every aspect. You kind of mentioned anti-Blackness. We didn't get to talk about that, but one of the things that I really want to focus on in the next few years is disrupting anti-Blackness within education and within the spaces that I work in, and helping to close that opportunity gap and putting the onus more on faculty. Right? You have we've been working on the I don't call it achievement gap, but most people know it as achievement gap. We've been working on the opportunity gap, since the 60s, and it's just growing wider for African American students. And I think one of the reasons is because we don't center equity and we don't put the onus on faculty who are at the front lines. And so that's kind of where I think I'm going to be focusing some of the work that I do in higher ed in the next few years. So when I'm grown up.
Yeah, well, happy birthday.
Thank
Let
you.
let me ask you this because you did mention anti-Blackness, and just for people who may not be familiar with that term, how do you define that for folks? And we do have a couple minutes. I'm wondering, often when we talk about anti-Blackness, it does look at some of that from what we face in reference to white folks, but do we sometimes see some anti-Blackness within the people of color community?
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, anti-Blackness is, racism against Black people that impacts their health, wealth, and safety, right? And it's widespread. It's designed in the fabric of this country. If you go back to 1619 with slavery, to 100 years of Jim Crow, to seeing it today in so many of the disparities that we see that African American communities are experiencing. And I think that I think it's the biggest social problem that exists. And I think that it's not just a white person problem, right? And so I've done a lot of work around anti-Blackness in South Asian communities. Now I'm seeing a lot more young people having these conversations because it exists, right? And I can speak about it from my own community because that's the community that I've grown up in and that I see personal examples in. But I know it exists in Latinx communities. It exists in other Asian communities. It exists in African communities, African immigrant communities, right? And so it even exists within African American communities, right? We have colorism, we have so many different internalized racism that goes on. So I absolutely think it exists. And I think that it's important for us to reflect and, be aware of our own biases and work to disrupt them, specifically around African American people. And I think everyone needs to stand in solidarity and be allies and advocates for African American people, because again, especially in my, life, if it wasn't for African American people paving the path for people like my community, my parents, my aunts, my uncles to come to this country, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have the opportunities that I have, right? The freedoms that I have, the successes that I have. And so they allowed us, African American people, allowed people like me and my community to have the successes and to be the problematic term of model minority, but we don't give onus and we don't give credit to the people who are fighting for our liberties and our rights and our acceptance. And so I think it's really important for anti-Blackness to be talked about in communities of color. I'm actually going to be doing a talk with Janice Gassam, who's a Forbes writer, in a couple of weeks about that exact topic, and not just South Asian, but in general. So I'll give you a link for it.
Send us some information and we'll be sure to publicize it in the WPC network.
Sure.
We got to let you go, but I don't want to let you go without asking you a few rapid fire questions, just 15, 30 seconds of response. And these are things just off the top of my head. So here it goes. What about code switching?
Yeah, what about it?
What's your thought? What comes to mind? Give me 30 second thought about code switching.
So I think that we need to embrace linguistic diversity and stay away from linguistic supremacy, which is what codes, not allowing people to code switch is. It's, just recentering linguistic supremacy. I think that code switching is not just something that African American people do. As a communication professional, the way you, speak your vernacular, it could be if you're high context or low context. It could be if you're, direct or indirect. And so there's so many different ways of code switching, and we have to be important not to always try to assimilate to the white American norm. In order to succeed in, professional context, you need to know the language of power, which is U.S. Standard English, but you also have to give room for people to speak in their home language. So that's what I think.
What about colorism? Give me some of your thoughts about colorism.
Yeah. So colorism exists across so many different communities of color, specifically in Indian communities. Multi-billion-dollar industry is skin lightening creams. And I think that this idea that we have to be lighter and whiter, which is more beautiful, is steeped in colonialism and is steeped in whiteness. And it exists today, from people from my community in South Asia. We brought that over today. And we have to kind of realize that this is not, you can be dark and beautiful and Black and beautiful. And there's many different notions of beauty, and we shouldn't be subscribing to Eurocentric notions of beauty. And when we do that, then we, are instilling colorism.
I just can't believe I'm asking you this question. I feel like I know this answer, but I'm going to do it anyway. Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, or Michael Jordan?
Michael Jordan, of course. I went to every rally when they won. I was like, a young person sleeping on the streets just to get into the rallies. I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan. Go Bulls.
I knew it. I asked that one, and I'm almost afraid to ask this one, but I got to since I'm here where I'm living. Chicago Bears or Green Bay Packers?
Chicago Bears. I have to go Bears. Yeah. I sat first row this year one of my mentees, her boyfriend is on the Bears, and she gave me front row tickets, and it was just the most mind-blowing thing to see a football game on, from the front row. And yeah, it was awesome. Yeah. Go
Oh,
Bears.
oh, I love it.
Thanks.
I love it. So I'm gonna ask you one last fun question. We've been
Okay.
collecting a list of what people are watching or reading or listening to, just to build some options for folks since we're closed in. So is there anything you've discovered or you've binged on or you've read, you listened to that you would
Yeah.
recommend for our COVID-19 list?
I have 3 books, and luckily they're right by me. This one isn't new, but if you haven't read this, How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, he is amazing, and he is somebody that has really shaped the way that I talk about race. And I appreciate that he is a Black man, and a lot of times, you read things about whiteness and racism from white people, so I really like that. Minda Harts, The Memo. I don't know if you know who Minda Harts is. You should interview her. She's awesome. This is about, women of color getting a seat at the table, and, especially in corporate America. And then Pamela Newkirk, Diversity Inc. This is really good, especially if you are wanting to be in the diversity and inclusion consulting field. So those are my three top choices. I don't watch TV or anything like that. I don't have time for that. So I just read.
Appreciate that. We were for a short amount of time going with what are you streaming, what are you watching, and then we had someone challenge us with expanding our offerings. So we hear you, we feel you on that, and thank you. We will definitely add those books to our list. Cindu, thank you for hanging out with us, giving us a little sneak preview into the work you do. And I'm so glad that you're out there grinding, not only teaching, but also consulting in the way that you're doing it. And if there's any way we could continue to collaborate, WPC, the Privilege Institute, with the work you're doing, let us know.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Peace, peace. Take care. Take care.